One of the best lines I've ever read about parenting was, "I was the greatest parent in the world until I had a child."
Hi, I'm Neil Perkin, the host of Think with Google Firestarters. And Firestarters, if you don't know by now, is a series of insightful conversations with the interested and interesting of the advertising, marketing and innovation communities. And today, I'm lucky enough to be speaking with Rob Estreitinho, who is the planning director at the multi-award-winning agency VCCP in London, and also the author of a brilliant weekly newsletter called Salmon Theory, which is worth subscribing for. So Rob, welcome to Firestarters. I'd like to just kick off by asking, what is your provocation for the Firestarters audience?
Well, firstly, thank you, Neil. I've been a fan of the series for a long time, so I'm very pleased to be here. My provocation is parents have a lot to teach planners, and planners have a lot to teach parents. We can go into whatever you want to go with that, but that's been a bit of an overarching thesis of mine, having been a planner for a while now, being experienced enough to say back in my day in 2009, but also I'm a new father, so we have a beautiful 18-year-old, and it's just been an amazing educational experience for me. But similar to how a few years ago I started drawing links between philosophy and planning, I kind of do the same between parenting and planning. So wherever you want to take that, we shall go there.
Brilliant. Well, I love the provocation. So, of course, I'm going to dive into that in a bit more detail. So let's start just thinking a bit about why. What can you learn from being a new parent, a new father, and how can you apply that to planning? Let's start
there. I guess the first thing is you start thinking everything's a scenario. Everything is scenario planning with planning and with parenting, right? Because in planning, contexts change, right? Market conditions change, specific circumstances around a brief change, budgets get cut, new budgets emerge, and suddenly, and things you thought were dead now are alive again and whatnot. With parenting, what I find is that you may feel like you're super well educated on like the principles and the theory and stuff, and we have done our research. Me and my partner are quite consciously trying to learn about what is sort of fruitful parenting these days. But all you need is for pardon my language, for the child to shit itself right before you leave the house, and then boom, you have a new scenario, right? So you essentially, a lot of it, or even let me maybe give you another example with food. So our daughter is now going through a bit of a change when it comes to eating, because she's teething quite a lot, and so she's quite uncomfortable with food. She doesn't always want it, etc. One way of looking at it is, well, the rule is we're at the table, the child must eat with the parents, etc. But a lot of it is scenario planning, because sometimes all she doesn't want is that particular spoon. All she doesn't want is a particular plate. I literally, just before coming to talk to you, I went downstairs and my partner was playing with our daughter while feeding her in the floor. So she was like, here's a ball, blah, blah, blah. Here's a bit of porridge. And that was, again, you had to adjust to the circumstances. She did not want to sit down in her chair. She did not want to be in the table. But ultimately, the goal is to get her to eat. So if she's more comfortable eating this way, it shouldn't be the rule, but perhaps it can be an option. And so that's what she did. So it's quite good to see that flexibility, I suppose.
So I love your point about context there. And I know you sort of framed this before as sort of flexibility equals strength
yes.
in a way. And so I guess I want to ask you, you're talking here about the need to be adaptive with strategy and planning and so on, drawing that parallel. But how do you know as a planner or a strategist when you should persevere and maybe when you should change and when you should adapt? So pivot or persevere?
Oh, that's tricky, isn't it? I mean, a lot of it, I guess, comes down to understanding if this is kind of a hill worth dying on, or if there is a bigger hill you're aiming for. So let me give you an example. We've been working on a campaign that's been going on for now 7 weeks for O2 and Love Island. And it's a pretty complex project, as a lot of sponsorship campaigns are. But we kind of had to consistently work out where do we basically stay the course because we had a strategy that was agreed with clients, etc., and where do we fundamentally just need to kind of like pivot. Let's give you an example. The first week we started activating the campaign, Twitter was going to be a gigantic part of it, and then basically just the sentiment on the platform was not it, right? The conversation around the show is much lesser. We had to basically change after week one. So the fundamentals of what we were trying to do for the brand and how we were trying to come across, they didn't change. So that's the bit where you go, nope, don't touch that. But the way we execute it had to fundamentally change. Now, in terms of, there are sometimes more tricky situations where you may have a disagreement on a core strategic level with your clients. And obviously that's a bit trickier. I suppose with that, there's no silver bullet answer for that. It comes down to trust and people kind of taking a bet on you, thinking you're doing the right thing. But most of the time, and I know sometimes this might be seen as a sign of weakness. I don't think it is, but I do think compromise is not a bad word. These are complex organizations. You need to know how to negotiate, and you don't always get what you want. But if you get, I don't know, 60% of what you want, I think that's a pretty good deal. A lot of people get 0%, so I'll take it. I'm a bit of a more on the satisficing, not optimizing school of thought, if that hasn't become apparent.
And I think speaking about context, there was something else I saw you write about how as a planner, your job is environmental. So I think you sort of mentioned it about you can't own all the answers, but you can own the conditions for good answers to emerge, which I really liked. So tell me a bit more about that.
So that's actually something that someone told me ages ago, and I never forgot. But I was a senior planner back then, and I was basically talking to a series of planning directors and kind of trying to understand what is it that requires you to be a planning director. And one of the tensions is always that you kind of at some point stop doing the work yourself as much and you kind of manage it in others. And someone just said this brilliant thing. They were like, I don't need to come up with the strategy. I just need to ensure there is one. And I was like, oh, interesting. For someone who's always had a bit of a perfectionist bone, which I'm trying to kind of be more gentle with and gentle around, I was like, that's actually quite a good sort of mantra. I suppose back to the reason I started thinking about this in the context of planning is, obviously as a manager, you just don't have time to do all of it yourself, no matter how perfectionist you are. It's like at some point you just got to outgrow that tendency of I'll just do it myself. I'm not perfect at it. I don't think anyone is, but I think I have struggled quite a lot over the years to do that. But I think now I am better at basically going, like, give you an example on this Low Volume campaign. I'm working with this brilliant planner. She's midweight, and a lot of times what I've had to almost against my every instinct, I go, do you know what? You don't need to run it past me. Just I trust you. And she's been doing a brilliant job. And it's like a muscle, right? The more you practice it, the stronger it gets, and the more okay it feels. Which I should say, by the way, is kind of how parenting works as well, right? You simply cannot force children to do things that they don't want to do. They might do it, but they probably will resent you. So it's a very tricky one to negotiate. Obviously, some exceptions apply. If they're being particularly misbehaved, you need to be lax about it. You need to be stern about what needs doing. But sometimes it's like how you educate your kids. So anyway, it's just that I've been slightly obsessed with that notion of I cannot control what people do, but I can kind of create circumstances around those things feel a little bit more natural, a little bit more safe, which sometimes is a big part of it. A lot of the times, I think people are afraid. I think we assume a lot of what other people won't like. And so the more you create an environment where it's like, don't assume what they won't like, just go and ask. Like, it's okay. I feel like those are the two words I say the most in my job. It's like, it's okay. Just go talk to so-and-so. Oh, you think he's pissed off, but you don't know. Go talk to them. It's okay. And if it's not okay, then I'll intervene. And most of the time it is okay, right? So That's why, yeah, that's the whole sentiment behind that environmental point. The other thing that I'm quite geeky about, which I've not written about yet, just because, frankly, it just feels like a giant can of worms, but I will get into it, is this concept of epigenetics, which is basically the study of how your environment can activate certain genes that already are dormant within you. So this, for me, is the perfect resolution for nature versus nurture. Because what happens is you have a lot of things that are your nature, but they only tend to get activated, or more likely to get activated, depending on the environment where you are nurtured. And I think that's a beautiful thought.
I mean, it's a really interesting thought, isn't it? And again, in relation to planning and how you can sort of create the environment, perhaps, in which things that you want to happen or outcomes you want to happen can actually happen. I mean, you talk about assumptions there, and I know you've actually spoken before about how expertise can sometimes lead to assumptions, and the need for a beginner's mindset. I guess there's a parallel here with parenting as well, isn't there? Like the assumption that we know the answers all the time. So tell me a bit more about that in the context of being a strategist.
Okay, so one thing. So actually, there's a parallel there that I think might be interesting. One of the best lines I've ever read about parenting was, "I was the greatest parent in the world until I had a child," which I think is quite true. I think we were humble enough to not go in with that, but we've basically miscalculated some things, or we thought we had it, and then once you think you got a grasp of it, kids just change, and then you got to learn all over again. I guess with planning, it's similar in that, let's say, for example, if you work on social, for argument's sake, that's kind of my background. At the moment, anything you thought worked on Twitter kind of doesn't, because Twitter is a bit of a crappy place right now, and it's probably not going to be called Twitter by the time this goes out, so who knows? So there is an element of relearning what is the appropriate way of behaving in that space for your brand, or sometimes even for yourself. At the same time, the fundamentals did not change at all. Whatever you did on Twitter, just do on Threads, right? So there is an element of, don't assume that what worked before is going to work again, or at least not in the same places. But at the same time, there are things you can take from that and adopt into this new world, right? You still hear of people, being hell-bent on, like, I don't know, the publishing stuff on their Facebook brand pages and kind of calling it a day. I think that's the thing where expertise kind of bothers me a little bit. It's that expertise feels quite static, right? It's like, I'm an expert, now I know everything. And I don't know if I have a more appropriate word. Maybe that's the most appropriate word, but it kind of suggests that you now have finished learning. It's a bit like you leave school. Oh, great, I don't have to study again. I mean, yeah, but also no. Like, I study every day because my job requires me to, and it's as it should be, right? It keeps you adaptable to how things change, and especially now, people worrying about AI and stuff. I don't think it will. I think AI is just the latest example of another mantra I have, which is, the best thing you can learn is how to keep learning, right? And I actually wonder sometimes. I joked. I see it as a joke, but kind of not really. But I'm 34, so I'm still at that point where, like, novelty feels still fresh and interesting. But there's going to be a point where some of it doesn't, right? It's just, you just end up not wanting to keep changing all the time. It's exhausting. So I do sometimes wonder, like, in which, how people say, oh, they did a bunch of dinosaurs, blah, 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 the old school. I sometimes wonder, in which way will I be a dinosaur? But maybe the fact that I wonder that means I will not likely be one, because I will always have that worry of, oh, am I assuming too much here? Am I kind of being a bit old and jaded and grumpy about it? So anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I suppose that element of you need to learn how to keep learning, for me, is quite important, on that sense of, like, especially as a planner, like, you always start a new category. Like, before you know, you get thrown into, like, B2B, and you're like, oh, I don't know anything about B2B. Well, now you have to, and you have 2 days. So yeah, it's interesting. By the way, I think tools like ChatGPT and Bard can actually be a fantastic assistant on that, because they're not great for a lot of things, but they are great of just giving you like background information on sort of certain subjects. So if you don't know anything about, I don't know, investment banking, you just go, what should I know? And then it gives you a bit of an index for things for you to go look into. So yeah, that beginner's mindset, that sense of you never stop learning. And frankly, life's boring if you stop learning. So just keep it interesting for yourself.
So one thing which I think relates to that is I think one thing you posted quite recently was about advice to junior planners.
Yes.
And one of those things was about the need to consume weirdly, which is a really lovely phrase. So I guess it relates to reading stuff perhaps that not everyone is reading. So tell me a bit more about this idea of consuming weirdly.
I think even in the best, most well-intentioned workplaces, there is a degree of consolidation and commoditization, not because of anyone's fault, but because it's almost like the system takes an identity of its own, and sometimes systems get out of control. That's what happens when a company's too big and a single person can't affect everything the company does. That said, the more we can do to encourage people to just bring, I wouldn't even say their full selves. You don't have to bring your full self to work, but bring a bit of weirdness into work, because especially in a creative environment, that is what will make you feel distinct from every other planner or creative or whatever other equivalent position that you're in your peers. B, I suppose you get the sense that there's a bit of ownership because there's a personal stamp in your work. And I guess those two things are probably enough, right? But like the best thing anyone can say about you is, oh, this sounds like a brief for Neil, because it means people have a pre-assumption about what is your thing, right? And that notion of you having a thing is literally what makes a brand, right? And I know personal brand is a bit of a weird washed out term, but the sense that people may not know you, but they may have heard of you and associate you with something is a fantastic career accelerant. A lot of people spend years in companies and they barely get noticed by senior management or whatever. Not that that's the only factor, of course, but I just think that having a bit of a reputation, hopefully a good one, is definitely something that you should have. And weirdness is, for me, the quickest shortcut for a distinction. Not creepy weird, but just like he's that person that knows the history of Dungeons and Dragons tabletop gaming, and therefore he should be brought into this fandom brief because he understands the psychology. You go, oh, that's weird, but it's useful. So useful weirdness perhaps is what you want to bring to work, not necessarily your full self. Obviously, not all places encourage, not all places reward your full self anyway, which is unfair, but it is a reality. But if you bring a bit of useful weirdness, I think that is perhaps a first step for people to appreciate you.
Yeah, and going back to that sort of parallels with parenting, I think one of the other things you say is about how averages have limited use, which I guess relates to this as well. So what do you mean about the limited use of averages?
I think averages freak the hell out of parents, right? Because let me give you an example. So our daughter had hip dysplasia when she was like 2 months old. It wasn't severe, but it was, serious enough for her to wear a harness. Now, the implications of that is that delayed her development around sitting and walking. She's getting there now, and we're seeing a physio, whatever. But I won't lie, I got worried once I started seeing that on average, kids start learning how to sit like at 12 months old or at 15 months old or whatever the stat is. And she's now 18. So I was like, oh man, is this a problem? Now, of course, all an average means is that some kids do it at 6 months, some kids do it at 24 months, and therefore the average is bang on there on 18, or I hope I did the maths right. And it's the same with planning, right? It's like, It's like look at the average annual household income for any country, and it's, for the United States at the moment is like $94,000. I was working on a project, so I know this. But that doesn't mean that most people have $94,000. It means that some people are really rich and some people are like earning 30K. So it's a danger, right? And I suppose that's the problem with all stats and all studies, where it's like on average so and so. But you go, yeah, but like a more interesting question is, what is the more frequent occurrence in that data set? Because if the more frequent occurrence, let's say on this income point, is $50,000, which doesn't feel nearly enough to have a good life in America, from what I know, but then all you need is someone else that earns 300K, then boom, your average just went up. But most people are miserable, so it's not very helpful. And back to the world of parenting, yes, on average, kids start saying their first words at X amount of months or sitting at X amount of months, but that doesn't mean if your kid is not at that stage yet, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with him or her. Because then what I notice as well is that a bit like as you get older, I suppose, if you have some sensory deprivation, let's say you're blind, your other senses tend to overcompensate. I kind of feel like sometimes something similar to that happens with kids. So, for example, our daughter is behind, quote unquote, on walking, but from what we know on the averages, she is ahead on knowing how to point to things and identify what is a nose, what is head, what is hair, etc. That's only meant to happen later, but it happened with her a few months ago. So it's a bit like when you play a video game, right? You can have, those video games where you can level up certain skills. You can level up everything more or less on average, but that means you're you're an okay player, but whatever. But what happens if you level up this one thing at the expense of that thing? On average, you're still at the same level, but you have these strengths that are much more powerful than any other player. So yeah, averages are useful as like an indication, but in the world of planning, I think we should investigate is that the most frequent occurrence? And I suppose in the world of parenting as well, with the side note of, if your kid is not within the average, that doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means, all kids develop differently. It's okay. So yeah, that's what I mean.
I guess it's relates to what you were saying earlier about how context is indispensable then, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose parenting groups help with that as well, because it just helps you see that where you feel your kid is behind, they might be ahead on something else. But by the way, even these expressions are not very helpful. It's not a competition. Like there are certain things you should be wary of. But at the same time, just be a bit gentle with your kids' development. I mean, they've been around for less than 2 years. Chill.
And I think, we're talking here about how you understand things and the importance of context. So I guess this leads us to talk a bit about insight. And you mentioned a bit about adopting the other side's view.
Yes.
So if you're a planner strategist, I guess that's about getting into the mind of the audience. But if you're a parent, it's about getting into the mind of your toddler, perhaps. So what are your tips on how you can do that well?
Well, I suppose firstly, just like do a bit of background reading. There's a lot of things that I think we understand and try to be empathetic towards our daughter that we wouldn't really have if we hadn't, like, frankly, bought a couple of books on it. So one, for example, is, everyone's quote favorite, not favorite, thing about kids, tantrums, right? Tantrums sometimes put us in a very irritable state where effectively we start tantruming back because we're like, stop doing that, whatever. Now, at a surface level, you don't know what else to do, and you basically you need the child to stay still, whatever. But if you read into the science of it, what is happening is children until a certain age are fundamentally incapable of controlling anger. So one way of reading it is, you're being very annoying. You shouldn't say that to your kids ever, by the way. But one way of reading it is, you're being very annoying. The other way is, you feel out of control and you don't know what to do, because effectively they are having this outburst of energy and anger and despair, whatever. And what they see is that when that happens, mommy and daddy scream back. And so that creates a very strange, unhelpful wiring in children's brain, right? Because they basically grow up to think that when they get angry, people would get angry back, and people will not accommodate for their feelings. Therefore, they will probably shove their feelings down, blah, 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 blah. It's like, but that wasn't the intention of the parent, but it is what's happening sometimes in the child's brain. Now, if you take to the world of planning, of course, you know, we don't spend nearly enough time doing primary research just to gain empathy of people. So that's the first step. I actually have been working with some people at VCCP to basically make primary research more democratized, because sometimes you just don't have the luxury of getting to a recruiter, finding people, you know, scheduling, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes you need something faster, but also that is not tainted by sort of, you know, you don't want to interview the marketers, right? That's a fruitless point. But you want to find quick ways of getting to people who, for example, are in the West Midlands and you don't know them. And so how do you do that? So we've been kind of developing some techniques to do that, primarily because it just gives you that sense of, oh, I see what it's like to be you. I was recently interviewing for a customer engagement project, and we were talking about play. And basically someone was like, well, the reason I like this particular toy is because I have a 14-year-old boy, and there is not much that 14-year-old boys will have in common with their mothers at this point. However, our Friday night films as we play is the one. And so for them, it was all about bonding, right? It was about fun, of course, but it was about having something to do with your child. And with time, sure, I might have gotten there, but hearing that firsthand, I was like, okay, this is a pretty big deal, especially if you have teenage kids. But I would even go, by the way, beyond audiences. I sometimes think we don't think enough like clients, not in a sense of we should second guess what they're thinking, but we should be very conscious of what they need to do to sell in the work internally, which I think sometimes in agencies we're a bit insulated from. But, you know, similar to how the best brands should be easy to think about and easy to buy, I would argue the same ideas are the same. But the best ideas. But the way to make them easy to think about and to make them easy to buy is you need to think like your client. You need to think, what is the most effective way of giving you something that you can then copy paste to some other presentation, and you don't need me in the room to explain why it's great. And not a lot of decks pass that test. So I'm slightly obsessed that mine try and do.
So I guess, does this relate to the risk of making assumptions? You were talking earlier about the risk of assuming a lot. It strikes me that, you know, if you're a sort of planner in a London agency, maybe you have a certain view on the world, you can make assumptions which perhaps go unquestioned. Do you think that's a danger or risk?
100%. I was just, so, you know, obviously now Threads has been on everyone's radar. I've actually just finished last week interviewing people from across the UK about, if you're using Threads, what do you like about it? Because frankly, I don't really care what the tech, I mean, I do care what the tech people have to say about it and what the early adopters have to say about it. But I was like, I want to speak to people that probably don't qualify as early adopter. They just use Instagram and thought this was fun, or they use Twitter and they thought this was fun. And that gave me some perspective as well on, like, what is it about this shiny new thing that real people like? Because otherwise, of course, like, you know, no matter how much we try, we're always influenced by the culture we're in. And that it works at a company level, it works at a sort of city level, it even works at a country level, even though the UK, of course, London versus the rest is very different. But there are ways in which I think about the world now that might feel very strange for someone back in Portugal, because I haven't lived there for 10 years. I have been influenced in some capacity by what the UK has offered me culturally, societally, etc. So, yeah, again, it is something that we say a lot, you know, the whole get out there, etc. I don't think get out there necessarily has to mean go and spend the weekend in Slough, although by all means do that if you want to, or go spend a weekend in York. But know how to find people that are from those places to give you that perspective. Because otherwise, yeah, we're just quite literally talking to ourselves, which a lot of ads do. And to VCCP's credit, one of the best things I've learned since being there, I've been there for almost 6 years now, is they're very hell-bent on, like, one of the ECDs always says, what would my mom think about this? And I think that's a fantastic question. And a lot of ideas don't necessarily pass that test. So I think that's a good one.
Yeah, nice. And my final question, unfortunately, we're running short on time, but my final question, I guess, kind of relates to this, because you've also talked a bit about what you call bringing the outside in. So I think, again, this relates to the advice to kind of junior planners and so on. So talking about how leaders help you develop, but they also can learn from you. So I guess thinking about parenting here, is there things that you can learn from your toddler that actually in the same way? You know, tell me a bit more about that sort of parallel.
So on the planning side, so every year we bring on board we have this program called The Table, which basically brings sort of people fresh out of uni, or even, like, you know, we have VCCP Stoke, where we partner with local universities as well. I find it fascinating to basically speak to those folks, because frankly, they don't come from the same place I do. They don't have the same level of education I do. Not that mine's better, it's just it's different. And therefore, they always have something. There's always something that completely flies under my radar, and they are experts in it. And I think that's interesting, right? So I don't remember where I saw, but someone was talking about reverse mentoring, where effectively you not only have a mentee that you guide, you have that mentee guide you as they show you, you know, here's what my friends are into right now. Or like, if you have, it's a bit like that thing of, if you have teenage cousins or whatever, just ask them what they're into. You'll learn stuff, right? You'll go like, oh my God, I didn't know CSGO was so big. I just thought it was for losers in basements, which is what a lot of people think about gaming, which is not true. But on the world of parenting, I guess this one might be a bit personal, but I think my daughter has helped me to learn how to slow down and kind of, quote unquote, smell the flowers. Sometimes all she wants is for me to be lying on the floor next to her, not doing anything, just being there, so she can kind of rub her head against me every now and then. And at first I was a bit like, oh my God, like I could be being more like productive. But perhaps that is productive, because you are being present, and a lot of parents are not. So it was actually something that before our daughter was born, I was very conscious of, which is, I don't want my own, I suppose, inner demons to become a blocker for this child to flourish. And one of my big flaws is I am not very good at standing still, which I know sounds like a bit of a humble brag, but sometimes it's like, it means I'm extremely distracted, and I'm not always very reliable on certain things around the house. Like, I literally forget something 1 minute to the next. Which is frustrating for my partner, so I want to acknowledge that. However, with our daughter, like, it just feels like time slows down, and everything I've read about it suggests that when time slows down, as you can actually appreciate things. When things are too fast, you barely have time to process them. But when things slow down, you breathe better. You sometimes think more clearly, because it's almost like you're imposing boredom in your life now, which we don't have enough of. And I think that helps certain lessons, I suppose, about who you are and who you want to be. They emerge because, frankly, you don't have anything else to think about. It's just like, oh, I'm doing nothing. And then you start mulling over it. Whereas if you're always busy, I think it's easy for us to feel productive, but not very fulfilled. That's how I certainly recognize it. I have been very productive over the last 10 years. Doesn't mean I've always been fulfilled, because I was just running away from something. A child brings you brutally into the present, but also into the far future. So I remember seeing Mark Zuckerberg saying something a few months ago about, like, we only think in either, what is it, over the next 6 months or the next 10 years, something like that. He was basically saying that so the middle term is where the least fruitful stuff happens. It's the short term, fix it now, or thinking for the long term. And I think children can be a fantastic lesson on that as well, because if your child is throwing a tantrum, you need to be here and now and know how to console them and how to understand them. But at the same time, you need to make decisions that will make financial, emotional sense in 10 years' time. right? Is this going to provide economic security when she's ready to go out into the world, et cetera, et cetera? And I quite like that duality of you're either now or way ahead in the future. I think that is an interesting, slightly counterintuitive way of looking at time, but I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Rob, I loved your provocation here, and loved chatting to you. Some really insightful thoughts there. But unfortunately, we're out of time. So my thanks go to Rob Estreitinho. If you want to subscribe to his Substack, it's robistyping.substack.com. That's Salmon Theory, brilliant newsletter. And my thanks again to Rob. If you enjoyed this episode, there are another 32, 33 episodes up on the Firestarters playlist. So please do subscribe and don't forget to share. So my thanks again to Rob. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Neil.